This year's summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has concluded in Bishkek on Friday. Against the backdrop of growing uncertainties all around the world, many expect the SCO to further consolidate cooperation and pool efforts to create a shared future of security and prosperity for all countries in the region. So what are the focuses this year, and how would the summit open broader prospects for the development of diplomatic ties in the region? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Ms. He Wenping from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Mr. Atul Aneja, Associate Editor of The Hindu. We will also cross over to our correspondent Michal Bardavid in Bishkek and Mr. Viktor Olovich from the Center for Actual Politics in Moscow. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Pandel. So, dear guests, talking about Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, let's start with security, because that's exactly where the organization started. Now, from the press release of this time's summit, Ms. He, have you sensed any new challenges faced by the SCO in the region in security?
Well, security is the topic, has been there all the time, because there's no single day that we are living in absolute peace or absolute security. So ever since the beginning, we all know that the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, has been built on from the previous called Shanghai, talk. And then before there's started from border security and how to, cut the size of the military. So ever since that, and then they are also counter those three forces. One is the separatist forces and the terrorist forces, and also the extremist forces. So from beginning until now, this security has been always the one of the keener, the key factor there. And of course, in the recent years, with this Belt and Road Initiative has been put forward, and now lots of economic cooperation and diplomatic cooperation has been engaged in. So security issue, we have witnessed very clearly that these members of SCOs has been done joint effort, like military drills has been taken place from time to time, and also share those intelligence information. So we have seen also clearly, even though we have been bothered, with each other, and then a lot of potential threat is there, but generally speaking,
what are those
it's
potential threats you just mentioned?
Yeah,
what are
three forces. Three forces.
What are their manifestations? Do you think they also evolve with the time? For example, with the help of technology, online propaganda from terrorist organizations? It's a global threat, right?
Yeah, of course, of course. They are not separated from the world. They are also, living in this internet society. So all those online, this recruiting member, and even those some plot, some terrorist attack, and maybe those things has been, undergoing. But luckily, because we have very, close cooperation, intelligence information sharing, so a lot of those plot has been destroyed before it has been really, undertaken. So this is, we should thankful for this very fruitful cooperation among those member countries. So of course the potential threat is there, but that's why I said they are very effective. We haven't seen a lot of those terrorist activity happening during the past 18 years. Yeah, even though we have heard from time to time happening in the Europe continent, even in those very key cities in Paris, in Berlin. Of course, not mention those Syria and Afghanistan and also Iraqi. So I think that has been proved very clearly. Now those mechanisms there, SCOs has played its job.
Do you think it's a success so far?
Yes, quite successful.
What's your take on this, Mr. Aneja? Because we know India and Pakistan joined the SCO 2 years ago, and by this kind of enlargement, some observers are already calling the SCO the largest trans-regional organization in the world. So in terms of security and stability, have you sensed any new momentum in the past 2 years?
Well, there's also you're discussing the security threats which are there, and terrorism is definitely a threat. Of course, it's been kept in check, but we can't let our guard down because this whole region borders Afghanistan, and these countries, especially Central Asia and then Iran, they are smack on the drug route, and drugs are used by terrorists for purchasing their guns and for weaponry, etc., and for all other kind of nefarious activity. So while we do have the RATS mechanism in Uzbekistan, which is basically monitoring and it's basically having a sort of pooling in intelligence from various sources about terrorist activity. So that's one thing. Fortunately, in RATS is one organization, when you talk about India and Pakistan, both countries have their own intelligence about security threats in the region, and that indirectly gets pooled into this mechanism. And I think that's a very good way, because of the relationship between India and Pakistan. We bilaterally may not share that intelligence, but SCO becomes a mechanism through which we do share that. I think from the Indian perspective, we need to have an outreach into Central Asia and other SCO countries, and because of Pakistan's geography, that presents a very important and natural corridor through which we can send goods, etc., and do our trade with Central Asian countries and join the major routes which are being developed along the Belt and the Road, or along the Eurasian landmass. So I think it's a great thing that India and Pakistan are there, despite the relationship not being what ideally it should be. But because of the presence, I think it's helpful that the two countries are in a way forced to interact with each other, are forced to have a dialogue with each other, which itself can build confidence. So I think this is a long-term strategic move to have India and Pakistan, and these particular differences may be something which are transient, and over time I think they're bound to overcome, because there are complementarities and there are compulsive reasons, both from the economic and security point of view, which sort of in a way persuade both countries to cooperate. So I think it's a long-term move, and it's with a lot of deep thinking that it has come through. Its potential is going to be realized in the future, I believe.
So since you have mentioned several specific countries, so let's start with Afghanistan. It's also mentioned in the press release of this time's summit, and the SCO support the work of the government of Afghanistan and its people for restoring peace and ensuring the country's sustained development. We know it's been a very difficult and process filled with fluctuations. What do you think is the biggest obstacle in the way?
Well, in this way is the lack of cohesiveness within Afghanistan, because when I was in the Middle East, I traveled to Afghanistan, and my journey had to be facilitated through various warlords which occupied certain particular places. When you go closer to Uzbekistan, then you had the Uzbeks like Rashid Dostum at that point of time. And similarly, there are various power centers within. So the cohesiveness of the state is not really there as much. It's improved much more than what it was, say, 2001, when the Taliban left Afghanistan. But then there are nodes of influences within these warlords. For example, the Iranians have their own influence, the Russians will have their own. Pakistan has a strong influence on Taliban, and India has been also a factor in that. So the challenge is to get all the countries together into a cohesive strategy. And then you have the American factor, which we cannot ignore. And they have their own interests in Afghanistan as well. Along with that, Afghanistan is a very resource-rich country. It had huge resources of lithium, for example, which is going to be used for electric cars and others. So, there is a need for a collective effort to get all the forces together to come to a framework of agreement. And I think SCO provides that platform where you can get most of them. Of course, the Americans are not part of it, but the rest of the countries are together. Iran is, I believe, an observer in the SCO.
And we'll be talking about that very soon. But now let's cross live to our correspondent, Mihal Bardavit in Bishkek. She's been following the whole event very closely on the ground. And Mihal, we know SCO leaders have signed the Bishkek Declaration on Friday that will reflect the vision of the further development of the organization and views of the most important international and regional issues. Tell us the main key messages in that declaration.
Yes, first of all, we're seeing that there's a lot more intent to cooperate in many different areas for the SCO members. That was discussed at the Heads of State Summit here in Bishkek. We see that already, since there's a lot of cooperation going on between these countries, there is more intent to further that cooperation, for example, against drug trafficking, information technology, environmental protection, mass media, as well as health. So these are some of the areas which they have signed agreements on to cooperate even further. There were also memorandum of understanding signed regarding the World of Tourism Organization, the UN Office of Coordination and Humanitarian Affairs, and the International Financial Center in Astana. So really we're seeing that there is a lot more areas that they will cooperate, but also with other bodies as well.
So earlier we were talking about security with our studio guests in our Beijing studio, and from the ground, what do you think is the main focus of this year's summit on security?
Yes, it seems that was the main topic on the agenda. That's really very critical right now. We saw, of course, in April there were terrorist attacks in Sri Lanka, which is also one of the dialogue members here. So we're seeing that that is one of the main topics that I would like to increase cooperation regarding security. The regional stability is, of course, one of the top priorities for this body. And when it comes to cooperation, there is a lot of room for intelligence sharing to prevent such critical terrorist attacks in this region. So that is one of the main areas that they would like to cooperate on regarding security. But there are also a lot of bilateral and multilateral meetings that also took place during the summit between many of the leaders here.
So we know this organization is also about confidence building and sharing experience and fruits of development, if you will. So let's turn to the relatively softer side of this. In terms of the economic component and people-to-people exchanges, what new ideas have you got?
Yes, it seems that that is one of the main messages that was also given by Chinese President Xi Jinping to increase cooperation and economic cooperation. For example, just to give you an idea from China's perspective, in 2018, China's trade with SCO member countries was around $255 billion. And when it comes to Chinese investments in SCO member states in 2018, that number was around $87 billion. So this is something that's very significant for, of course, the people of these countries, just to see that the kind of cooperation in terms of the economy can really increase further. And this is some of the intent of the leaders of the SCO. That's some of their main messages, that they want to increase these numbers. And when it comes to cultural exchanges, Chinese President Xi has also emphasized this over and over again, stating that cultural exchanges, people-to-people exchanges, these are the things that bring nations closer together. And that is what they really want here to happen. So those were some of the messages that were emphasized during the speeches by leaders here.
Thank you very much, our correspondent Michal Bartwit in Bishkek. So, dear guests, since our correspondent mentioned this keynote speech from Chinese President Xi Jinping at this year's SCO summit, let's talk more about that. In that speech, President Xi Jinping emphasized the importance of the Shanghai spirit. Ms. Ho, what exactly is this Shanghai spirit?
I think the key element of the Shanghai spirit that is the cooperation and reach the consensus, because we all know last year the Pakistan and the India, these two countries has been becoming the new member of the SCO. Everybody knows that two countries, they have some conflict between them. So this is a diversity now, even among the members. So how to reach consensus among those diversities? So there is some opinion saying, well, the SCO now, including those members, even have a conflict among each other. So they want to see this, all these SCOs go to the downturn. It's not something, can be shared with others, because you cannot develop yourself very well. But actually now, with this, the new summit here in Bishkek, and these two countries, they have been, behaved as a, I think it's quite normal, huh? It's not something happening and some fighting happening. So this is one of the spirit that is reach consensus from this diversity. So diversity doesn't cause any fundamental hurdles for those cooperation, because now we want to counter terrorism. Both Pakistan and India, they also share this goal, and also those observation countries like Afghanistan, even like Iran, they are facing those security challenge. And all of the countries, they also want to further and deepen this economic cooperation, because we all understand.
That's a very good point here,
yes,
because we cannot talk about security by focusing on security alone, and economic development, poverty, closely related root cause of terrorism. Mr. Anijo, what would you say the Belt and Road initiative proposed by China, what role it can play in dealing with these root causes?
I think connectivity is a very, very important issue, both in terms of economic development as well as to fight terrorism. So it serves a twin purpose. And you can see that under the framework of that, there are new connectivity nodes which are being created. For example, in Kyrgyzstan, there is the Irtisham Pass, through which new roads are being built. The railway is passing. It goes to Osh in the south of Kyrgyzstan. But this is separated from the north of Kyrgyzstan, so a new road is being built by China to connect the south and the north. Now it's going to create a huge, both in terms of counter-terrorism as well as potential for economic development. I assume there'll be new industrial parks, etc., which will come into that. So this is a Belt and Road initiative, which without getting into nomenclature, I think this connectivity, and just not physical connectivity, there are other dimensions to it as well. So this would have a positive impact, in my view, on the overall lifting of the economies. But that alone may not be enough, because we need to have other dimensions. For example, skill development of the people. The human capital has to be really come up to international standards before this region can compete with other power centers in the world. So it's a very important beginning, the construction of infrastructure, both hard and soft infrastructure. I think it's a must, but we still have a long way to go. We also need to be culturally sensitive, because each of these regions, like in Central Asia, there's a Turkic element into it. The Persians have had an influence over there. So it's got and the Russians have had an influence, which has culturally influenced the region. So when China goes and develops it, it has to be very cautious of the cultural nuances as well, so that we don't just go by hard infrastructure, but also manage it in a way which sort of carries the people along by being culturally sensitive to the region.
And that's also a crucial connectivity, the connectivity of
Soft
different
connectivity,
minds.
absolutely.
And talking about that, let's cross live to Mr. Viktor Olevich in Moscow. Mr. Olevich, let's continue our topic here, talking about the road. The Belt and Road Initiative may play in the further development of the SCO. We know China and Russia cooperating very closely under the umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative. Also, the Russia proposed a Eurasian economic plan. Tell us what kind of momentum will this kind of cooperation bring to the SCO and regional stability?
Well, of course, cooperation between China and Russia has reached new heights in the last several years and last several months. And in fact, the geopolitical climate serves that very well. The more the Americans keep pushing Russia and China, the more they are inclined to come closer together on economic issues, on humanitarian issues, socio-political issues, and military cooperation. And that involves one Belt, One Road, that also involves cooperating in Central Asia. I would remind you that next year, the host of the SCO summit is Russia. The next summit is going to, in 2020, is going to be held in the city of Chelyabinsk. And we are seeing closer cooperation on infrastructure projects in Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan, in Tajikistan, also in the most populous Republic of Central Asia, in Uzbekistan, which has a number of issues that both China and Russia are involved in resolving. Also, the new president of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, is very active at the SCO summit and is very inclined towards cooperation with both Russia and China. I would also, as far as India, it is very interesting that India is at the same time being encouraged by the United States to take a more pro-American position and a position that is more congruent with America's foreign policy. But at the same time, India does not want to take down a notch its relations with China or with Russia. It understands Narendra Modi, who has just been re-elected as India's Prime Minister, understands very well that it is in India's national interest to maneuver, to leverage different relationships to the benefit of his own country.
Well, Mr. Olivic,
So
since you
we are
mentioned
going
India,
to
we
see
have
that
to ask Ms.
India,
Anija in our studio.
wants at the
Do you
same time-
agree what Mr. Olivic just said about India's diplomacy right now?
No, I think it's a multi-vector diplomacy like any other country. But I think India will guard its own interests first rather than be an extension of the United States. I think that's far from it. I think this assumption that India in the SCO is doing US bidding, I think that's wholly incorrect. So
how would you describe
if
India's positioning right now?
Right now, for example, the first meeting which Prime Minister Modi had yesterday and the sidelines was with President Xi Jinping.
And let's remember, this was right after his re-election.
This was right after his re-election. And look at the China-India relationship, the way it has moved after the Wuhan summit, which took place last year. And one of the topics, both leaders yesterday took Wuhan as the touchstone for the next meeting which is going to take place. They're talking of corridors, BCIM, they're talking about the trade issues with the United States and whether they can come together. So with China, India has a very substantial agenda as well, which is separate from the US agenda, which we have areas of cooperation with the US as well. But the two are on separate tracks. And thirdly, we have a very strong relationship, a traditional relationship with Russia. For example, most of India's strategic weapons, I'm talking of nuclear submarines, etc., they are coming from Russia and not from the United States or from Israel. So India has the doctrine of strategic autonomy, which is the basis where we look at our interests independently and go along with countries where these interests get fulfilled and are not in contradiction with each other. So I think that's a basic doctrine on which India is operating. But knowing the very fact that the center of gravity in the world is moving towards the Asia-Pacific. The Americans like to call it the Indo-Pacific. And so it is natural that India will look eastwards, and it's natural that India will look towards China, it will look towards Eurasia. And I do think that Mr. Modi's own position is reflective of this shift in the overall geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape. So India will be naturally inclined towards the region while maintaining a good relationship with the United States, which incidentally is getting a little problematic now in the trade issues involved, and there are threats of sort of another trade restrictions on Indian products in the United States. So it's going to balance out its relationship.
Right, and we know Russia will host next year's SCO summit. So again, let's talk to Mr. Viktor Olivic in Moscow. Let me ask you a question about the security, and this is mentioned in this year's press release of the SCO summit, and the leaders emphasized that the unacceptability of attempts to ensure one country's security at the expense of other countries' security, and noted that the unilateral and unlimited build-up of missile defense systems by certain countries or groups of states was detrimental to international security and a destabilizing factor in the world. What are the leaders talking about here?
Well, of course, they are talking about the unilateral approach of the Trump administration towards resolving international crisis and other world problems. And both Russia and China and other SCO members are interested in a multilateral approach, just as my colleague said. And they understand perfectly that only a multilateral approach that involves all neighboring nations is going to lead to a solution that will result in peace, in prosperity and stability. That is equally important in resolving the North Korean nuclear issue. That is equally important in resolving the crisis around Syria and the civil war there. Is equally important in resolving crisis in Ukraine. And in fact, it is equally important in resolving the problems that India and Pakistan have had over the years. And so this unilateral approach that the Trump administration has been leading in the past 2 years has not brought the fruit that it has been looking for. In fact, the international situation has become more unstable. And the SCO is attempting to do everything it can to stabilize the situation and make sure that Washington's attempt at international diktat is not successful. And of course, I heard what my colleague said about India. Of course, India's approach is and has been multilateral, but it has to maneuver between between its partners, Russia and China and others on the one hand, and the United States, which is attempting to push it the other way on the other hand. And we are going to see how successful Prime Minister Modi is going to be at that in the coming months and years.
Thank you very much, Mr. Viktor Olevich in Moscow. Now, let's talk about another daunting challenge, that is the Iran issue. And the SCO summit leaders, they consider it important to steadily implement a joint comprehensive plan of action, or commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal, regarding the Iran nuclear program under the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, that calls on all the parties to fulfill their obligations unfailingly. So, do you think this is a support to the current nuclear deal?
That's absolutely. It's show a very strong support. You know, among the SCO members, Russia and China are the signatory countries for this Iran nuclear deal. So now this nuclear deal now is at a very dangerous time. U.S. withdraw unilaterally from this deal.
And looking at latest attacks on oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, that's true. And that drives the oil price, and then again on the rise. Before it's already stabilized.
Since you mentioned oil, it's very interesting that some major buyers of Iranian oil are trying to bypassing U.S. sanctions. For example, the EU has already carried out this Instax mechanism, right?
Yes, they're trying to help Iran to out of this chaos.
So back to the question, what the role the SCO can play in this?
At least SCO as a platform, as a mechanism, has those 8 countries together. They can send out a single unified voice. That is, this nuclear deal, Iran nuclear deal, should be maintained rather than to continue to destroy it. So they also support Iran, like fully abide by this nuclear deal, those duties. Yeah, also encourage Iran not follow like U.S. those footsteps, saying, oh, I cannot tolerate it anymore. I also want to quit from this nuclear deal. So this is this is not the thing the SCO members want to see. Like Russia, President Putin has mentioned very clear. So he encouraged Iran remain in this deal, not like the United States, the way they're doing. But Iran is also want to get help from these SCOs, saying we are doing things like abide by the deal, but we cannot survive by ourselves. We need help. So these SCOs also offer this kind of at least diplomatic support. But in terms of those other support, because you mentioned the EU now is trying to offer some specific, this independent financial payment, this kind of system. But easy said than done. It takes a longer period to finalize all this process, because those SWIFT, this mechanism now in the charge of U.S. hand has been there for decades. So it has been, has a lot of those systems all over the world. So for a new payment system coming out, it takes time, also takes a lot of technical support. So all of this is not saying EU or other countries just take a wait and see approach. They are working, but takes time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ho Yinping and Mr. To Anija there. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Pandong in Beijing. Bye-bye.